Trailblazers like Claire Rayner had put sex on the Agony Aunt's agenda, although some of her colleagues struggled to answer the more upfront questions they received. And some readers fretted that they weren't having nearly as much fun as they should be.
In the early 70s, suddenly there were words like penis and vagina and orgasm and premature ejaculation on the page, and it was absolutely extraordinary because although I was quite a rackety girl in the 60s, I still found it very difficult to, I mean, I didn't like to, none of us would want to actually use the word vagina, and indeed I don't think today one actually bandies the word around every day. But one was expected to be quite frank in the page. People would write in because it was as if a cork had come out of a champagne bottle. They'd been so repressed about sex for so long, suddenly every single question was about sex.
Can you give me an example of the sort of letter you had to answer?
It was painful. People would write saying, "Where is my G-spot?" You know, and I'd be there sort of, I don't know where your G-spot is. You know, it was extremely hard for me. One woman wrote in saying, "How many calories are there in semen?" I mean, it was a difficult one to answer.
Did you have help answering?
Well, I did, but unfortunately I'd inherited the letter answerers who were 80-year-old spinsters. One of them actually died at her desk, and these women were absolutely sweet, and they were adept at answering any question like, do I take my gloves off when shaking hands with the bishop? Or how do I eat an avocado pear? There was actually a leaflet we had on how to eat an avocado pear. But of course they were baffled by these sex questions, and they'd come into me with holding these letters like used tissues, saying, what we don't understand. I always remember one of them coming into my room looking extremely worried, saying, "How can I answer this?" And I said, what's it about? She said, "This lady wishes to know, what is a blowjob?" I said, "Leave it to me."
We've gone from a time in the early 60s when sex isn't discussed at all on the problem page to a time just 10 years later when it's the main thing.
Yes, and what was interesting was that there was a huge pressure on women when sex wasn't discussed, of course, because there was no knowledge at all, and the number of girls who must have gone to bed sick with worry, thinking that they were going to get pregnant because they'd kissed their boyfriends. And that was one kind of pressure that you had then, terror of sex, and probably a great deal of anxiety surrounding it. But then when the sexual revolution came in, there was another kind of anxiety, which was that you weren't having enough, that it wasn't good enough, you weren't having enough orgasms, you weren't doing it from, on the kitchen table. I remember there was a lot of talk about, you must do it in every room in the house, and somehow the kitchen table always came into it. There seemed to be far too much attention paid to sex, and the implication that if you didn't have a good sex life, you were going to get ill and possibly get cancer, that certainly if you didn't have simultaneous orgasms, you and your husband were totally incompatible, and you were doomed. There was a terrible kind of compulsory feeling about sex, that it had to be had and enjoyed, or...
There's a sort of tyranny about it.
It was terrible tyranny, yes. You will like sex whether you like it or not.
You will orgasm simultaneously.
Yes, exactly. And again, however much I wrote saying, don't worry, don't worry, don't worry, it didn't seem to make any difference.